Greetings everyone. I'd like to thank the South London People's Assembly for inviting myself and my co-chair of Barrack UK, Lee Jasper, to this People's Assembly. I want to start by saying something about Nelson Mandela, and I'm sure that you've already heard something said, and I understand there's been silence this morning, but I think it's really important given where we are and the timing of this event and his death. Nelson Mandela stood for freedom, he stood for justice, he stood for equality, he stood against racism, against hatred and against apartheid. But he was also a revolutionary. And what we're seeing in the last 24 hours or so is public figures and politicians coming out declaring how they stood against apartheid, completely hypocritical when they didn't. Because actually the Labour movement, the Labour Party, the trade unions had to be dragged into standing against apartheid. So I'm not saying that they didn't play an important role. Eventually they did, but they didn't come forward straight away. Nelson Mandela was labelled a terrorist, and we need to remember the reality of what happened, but we also need to remember what he stood for and what he did, because he's been portrayed in the media at the moment into this public figure that stood for peace. Yes, he stood for peace, but he was a revolutionary and he was a campaigner and he was a fighter for justice and equality. I'm proud that as a student I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and also the successor organisation to the AAM, AXA, I'm part of that, and I was involved yesterday in organising a vigil outside South Africa House in Trafalgar Square. And it was an uplifting event, it was a celebratory event celebrating Mandela's life, Madiba's life. And I want to share a quote with you from Nelson Mandela. He said, "Overcoming poverty is not a task of charity, it's an act of justice. Like slavery and apartheid, it's man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. Sometimes that falls on a generation to be great. You can be that generation." And I think that the best way that we can honour Nelson Mandela's memory is to continue with his legacy. Nelson Mandela and the ANC fought apartheid, and the reality here in the UK is it's becoming more like an apartheid state every day. You look at the immigration bill, it's the most racist piece of legislation I've seen in my lifetime. And I'd urge people to get involved in the movement against xenophobia, the MAX campaign, which Barrack and lots of other organisations, around 100 organisations, are part of, to challenge the immigration bill, which will see a return to the no dogs, no Irish, no blacks signs on our street. And we need to get behind that campaign. We need to challenge, because if you look at the mainstream politicians, very few of them are standing up against it and voting against it. And we must also campaign, when we campaign against cuts and austerity, against racism and other forms of discrimination. Challenge not just the disproportionate impact of cuts on black and migrant people, but we need to challenge the targeting of black and migrant people as the cause of cuts and austerity and poverty. And we need to counter the myths and the lies and the scapegoating of black people. And we need to do that. We can't rely on the mainstream press, but we need to challenge the mainstream press. And we also need to counter through social media what's been said. And we need to challenge not just the discrimination and the disproportionate impact related to austerity, but the whole racist agenda of this government at the moment. So that includes in the criminal justice system, in policing, in the judicial system, as well as in the labour market and wider societies, in our institutions. And for those of you here who are white, use white privilege to change thinking and change minds. And I want to end saying something about the People's Assemblies and how we can engage with the wider communities that we're based in. And I think for people's assemblies to succeed, they need to include, they must include all communities. And that may mean that for some people that haven't been activists before, haven't been to an event like this, don't go to public meetings, who are struggling to make ends meet, who are holding down tool-free shifts, who are living in dire poverty, this might not be an accessible event for them. So one of the things that we need to do is not expect, because we've communicated that the people's assemblies are happening around the country, that people will come to them. We need to take the assemblies to the communities that they're based in. When we challenge discrimination, it benefits everybody. And if we're for equality, we must demonstrate that we're against racism, and we must take action against racism. And that's not just by signing petitions and going to anti-fascist protests, which are very important and we must participate in, but we must also stand by our colleagues, our neighbours and people in our communities and not give not just solidarity, but practical support.